Now, China's FDI stock across economies in Africa has more than doubled between 2011 and 2017. It rose from about $16 billion all the way to $40 billion last year. Now, there are more privately owned Chinese firms that are investing in and trading right across the continent. Transsion Holdings, for instance, sells more phones across the continent than Samsung does. Now, these kind of investments, though, they could be threatened by the trade route between China on one hand and the US on the other. Ahead of the China International Import Expo in Shanghai in November, I explored how African firms could be affected by this trade dispute with the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Arancha Gonzalez.
The base of this big pyramid that is our economy, that is composed of millions of micro, small and medium enterprises, are going to be very sorely affected by the rivalry that we have seen develop between the United States and China. And this is why we in the International Trade Center have been calling for dialogue, cooperation multilaterally to address the difficulties. We understand there are difficulties. There are difficulties on both sides, by the way. There are difficulties overall in the area of international trade. But the answer to these difficulties is not unilateral trade measures, is not TIT, which will be answered by TAT, but rather parties sitting around the table, preferably in the World Trade Organization, which is the organization that gathers all of them, to find a common course to address these challenges affecting international trade today.
Speaking of win-win results, the WTO essentially a bit hobbled in part by all this mistrust that we're seeing at the moment. But there are concrete things that we can do to at least lay the groundwork for that reform of the WTO to essentially make trade and commerce a lot easier across the board. Walk us through the priorities as you see them from the ITC's perspective on what we need to do to make the WTO much better, much more fit for purpose.
I think there is three big areas that need to be tackled in making the WTO fit for the 21st century purpose. First one has to do with the new rules that would address the interface between trade and technology. It's true that technology was not a big issue when the WTO was last reformed in 1995. But today, the economy of the 21st century is the digital economy. It's about cybersecurity. It's, as we just said, electronic commerce. It's about intellectual property. It's about data flows, data protection. So all of this needs to be better regulated. The second big area is the ordinary functioning of the organization, transparency, and having mechanisms that would prevent the differences from escalating into disputes. The third big area is the dispute settlement of the WTO. This is an organization that has a very robust means to settle disputes and to settle them in a manner that would guarantee the rule of law rather than the rule of the strongest, which I think is it means progress in international relations. This dispute settlement today requires a bit of a revamp, but again, it requires everybody around the table. It requires everybody listening to each other, and it requires everybody contributing to the solution.
Just to go back to the e-commerce question, we're seeing a lot more countries moving towards the direction of what they regard as data sovereignty. So, for example, in India, we're seeing payments processors like Visa, MasterCard, and so on being told you have to store your data in the country. It can't simply be a case of you processing information, taking it out of the country, we don't know what you're doing with it, and then bringing it back. Is that an impediment from your perspective? Is that an impediment to the expansion of global trade, especially given how payment systems now pretty much span right across the world and consumers expect to be able to pay for things pretty much instantaneously regardless of where they are on the planet?
I think we have to find a balance between the preoccupation of many governments and many consumers and many citizens about what happens with the data that they represent and that it's in the hands of private companies or public companies. So we need, on the one hand, to answer to the citizens' concern about what happens with this data, who uses it and for which purpose. But on the other hand, we have to accept that the economy of the 21st century is based on data, and is based on data that is flowing and that is as compatible between countries as possible. So we have to find a balance. And obviously this requires a dialogue. And in my view, it's better to manage finding this balance in a cooperative manner than having every country regulate this on an individual basis, because fragmentation in this space may simply cut off certain parts of the world from being part of this technological and digital revolution.